Hey there world, I'm your friendly internet DM Devious, and this is the Beginner's Guide to D&D 3.5 Edition. I wanted to make this video series to explain this kind of game to an audience that has perhaps no experience with Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe even tabletop games in general. I will admit, I'm partially motivated by the fact that I've become the de facto resource for my friends on this topic and just want to stop explaining stuff, but besides that, I'm hoping I can help people understand a medium that I've loved for almost a decade. As of the recording of this video, I'm 19 years old, and I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since the 6th grade. When I was a kid and trying to get into D&D, I was basically dropped in, fresh-faced with little playing experience into the role of Dungeon Master. Poorly prepared, I fumbled through the rulebook, absorbing as much as I could, but really just ended up confusing myself and everyone else I tried to explain the rules to. Ultimately, this video series is how I'm trying to help other people avoid this problem. This series is for people who have trouble getting all the information just from reading the rulebooks, or are maybe just worried they'll miss something important, in order to help people make sense of a complicated but fulfilling system. With a little help, I think every person is capable of playing and enjoying D&D. Alright, are we ready to get started? I should start off by saying that if you're familiar with another tabletop RPG or even a different edition of Dungeons & Dragons, you might want to skip this one, because I'm just going to be going over a bunch of stuff you already know, as the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is Dungeons & Dragons? Now, the simplest definition of that would be Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game. However, that's not really satisfying if you're new to the genre, so let's dive in further. First off, let's define a role-playing game. A role-playing game, RPG for short, is a game in which players take the roles of characters in a fictional universe. You play as your characters within the narrative of the setting, taking actions appropriate for your character as defined by a set of rules that governs what can or cannot be done and whether what you do succeeds or fails. Pretty simple so far, and a tabletop RPG has only really one defining trait, which is that all players act by describing their actions, usually through speech. Not even the tabletop is a defining part, it's really just a moniker to distinguish this type of RPG from others, as the defining characteristic is that as a player, you merely say what you're intending to do. Now is when we start getting more specific. Many tabletop RPGs, including D&D, have a specially designated player who masterminds the experience, known in D&D as the Dungeon Master, or DM. The job of the DM is to create the game in which the players play, describing the setting, taking the roles of all non-player characters or NPCs, and describing the outcomes of players' intended actions. In the same way that the players assume the roles of their characters, the DM assumes the role of the world in order to represent it to the players through vivid description. D&D itself is a fantasy game, you know, the kind with elves and dwarves and magic and stuff. However, that's ultimately up to your DM's discretion. As a player, you are just a character in their world trying to do whatever it is you're trying to do. Alright, so when you want to play D&D, you gather together your DM and all of your players and you have what we call a session. A session is a single instance inside the overall game that tends to last about 3 to 6 hours in my experience, although it's ultimately up to how long the group wants to play and where good stopping points are. So, now that we know where we are and in general what we're doing, how do we play? Well, as I mentioned earlier, to do anything in D&D you have to describe your actions. Most of your actions are going to be immediately successful and the DM will just describe the outcome. You say you look around, they say what you see. You say you walk into a room, they say what's in it. You say you start a conversation with someone, they respond in character. However, the part that gets complicated is when your success isn't immediately guaranteed, in which case you get to use these. Dice rolling is the backbone of D&D. When you're doing something with uncertainty in its outcome, you almost always have to roll a die. If you want to hit someone, you have to roll, and if you fail, you miss. If you're climbing up a cliff, you roll, and if you fail, you might fall. If you're trying to look through a room for clues or treasure, you roll, and if you fail, you find nothing. Rolls are about chance, introducing randomness or semi-randomness into your play. After all, if you just succeeded at everything you tried, it wouldn't be interesting or realistic. Now let's get into the dice themselves. First, let's talk about nomenclature. There's a specific way we refer to dice in D&D, with a die being indicated by a number, then the letter D, then another number. The first number indicates how many dice you're rolling, and the second number shows how many sides those dice have. So, if the DM or your rulebook tell you to roll 3d6, you roll 3 6-sided dice and add them all up. I should note that usually if you only have to roll one die, then the first number is omitted. So let's talk about the dice. In D&D, we have 6 types of dice. We have D4s, D6s, D8s, D10s, D12s, and D20s. The D20 is probably the one you should remember the most because chances are you'll end up rolling D20s the most out of any die, probably more than all the other dice combined. Now, sometimes the situation will call for an abnormal dice value, but you can use these dice and only these dice to make any roll you're called for. There are only 3 examples I can think of at the moment, which are D2s, D3s, and D100s. D2 is ultimately just a coin, but if you don't have one, roll any even-sided die. So any die. Call an odd number a 1 and an even number a 2. You need a D3, just roll a D6 and count rolls of 4, 5, or 6 as 1, 2, and 3 respectively. The D100 is a bit special. Most sets of dice come with 2 D10s, one marked 1 to 10, and one marked 0 to 90 in increments of 10. To roll a D100, you roll both, and add the marked values together, which has the same potential outcomes as rolling one die with 100 sides. This roll is also special in that it has its own name, which is more commonly referred to as, that being percentile dice. Whenever you're asked to roll percentiles, you roll 2 d10s and take 1 as the tens place and 1 as the ones place. Now we've defined what the game is and what our roles are within the game. We've talked about the nature of taking actions and making rolls. Now, to end this introduction, a question that I am asked quite often by newcomers to the formula. How long does a game of D&D last? Honestly, it's not predetermined in any way how long the game lasts. A game of D&D can start and finish in a single session and be short and sweet, or it can be a sprawling epic that takes years to play, or anywhere in between. All about the story that you and your DM want to tell together, and it's not anyone's place to decide for you how long you should take. Alright guys, that wraps up this introduction. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to tune in again next video when we start talking about making your first character.